Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the LEA Special Education Point of Contact monthly webinar for February 2021. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. In preparation for our presentation today, we have uploaded a copy of this PowerPoint presentation in the Handouts tab and GoToWebinar. So if you click down during by the handouts, your GoToWebinar screen, you will see a PDF version of our presentation this morning. We do have a lot to present this morning, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Tiffany Ingram, and I'm a program analyst here at OSSE in the K-12 System and Support division, and I'm working today with people across divisions here at OSSE to provide you all updates for your role as the Special Education PLC. Today, our agenda will cover policy reminders and updates. We will go through IDA monitoring reminders and updates. We will have assessments, updates from the team here, as well as updates from the reminders from our transportation team. And we will close out with announcements and reminders from our Office of Teaching and Learning. And we will start off this morning with policy reminders and updates, and I will turn it over to Christy.
Good morning, everybody. This is Christy Weaver-Harris, the Policy Manager in OSSE's Division of K-12 Systems and Supports. Next slide, please. So today we're going to be kicking off our discussions about ESY, if you can believe it's already ESY season. So in accordance with OSSE's ESY Services policy, all LEAs are required to certify ESY data to OSSE by the first Monday in May. And this year, the 2021 deadline for ESY certification is Monday, May 3rd, 2021. The purpose of certification is to assist you and non-public schools in planning appropriately for programming and staffing over the ESY timeframe, which is usually over the summer. And it also assists OSSE in anticipating state-level expenses related to ESY reimbursements and for transportation needs. So the biggest impact here is really on ESY-related transportation, but we do want to see confirmation of ESY eligibility determinations and all the other appropriate documentation uploaded in SEDS before the first Monday in May. Next slide, please. So an LEA has completed ESY certification when student level ESY eligibility determinations and designated goals and services have been completed in SEDS as part of a finalized IEP. Certification also includes updating ESY calendar and bell times in TOTE for the purposes of transportation, updating student demographic information, including like yes, no ESY eligibility, or confirming yes, no ESY eligibility, and ESY location information in TOTE, and uploading all transportation request forms into TOTE by Monday, May 3rd. So later this month, we will be, or this month or early next month, we will be communicating with LEA leaders. And again, during the March webinar, we will have more information about like final dates and deadlines related to like uploading data and information. But if you've done this in the past, you know that to have certification done by Monday, May 3rd, you have to have everything in the system at least 1 to 2 days ahead of time to make sure that when the systems do the overnight rollover, so when you make your ESY determinations and designations in SEDS, you have to give it one night to show up in TOTE. So we do recommend that you have ESY related eligibility determinations and all the necessary information in SEDS no later than Friday, April 3rd, or I'm sorry, April 30th of 2021. But again, we will be releasing that calendar in the next couple of weeks. Next slide, please. So if a student has been making some progress toward IEP goals during remote learning, the IEP team may decide to provide additional ESY services through additional remote instruction or through in-person instruction. In reality, we suspect that all students are experiencing regression of some sort. I want to be honest about that. We've seen the data, we know that there's some regression occurring. And sometimes ESY gets lumped in with compensatory education. ESY is different from compensatory education or comp ed. ESY is provided for the purposes of preventing substantial regression, while compensatory education services are a remedy awarded after an LEA is found to have failed to provide FAPE. So I just want to clear that up front. OSSE has tried to be very specific in our language around the differences between ESY services, compensatory education, and recovery services. Recovery services are services that your LEA may choose to provide to students when you recognize that a child has regressed. But compensatory education, like the formal phrasing of compensatory education, is a legal remedy that is awarded after an LEA has failed to provide FAPE. So LEAs and IEP teams must use student-level data to analyze and quantify the likely impact of a break in service on a student's educational benefit. And you're going to do that through a discussion of critical skill regression and recoupment generally. IEP teams must use 3 months of progress monitoring data, but if 3 months of data aren't available, please use any relevant current data or information that you have about a student. The 3 months of data requirement is in OSSE's ESY policy, but we do recognize that you don't always have 3 months. So please make sure that you're just using relevant data to inform these decisions. And examples of data or information can include historical data about the child's rate of progress toward critical skill attainment, historical data about their rate of regression of a critical skill, and like historical data and prior experience around the child's time needed to recoup a critical skill that had been lost or that they had shown regression with. Other examples of data or information would be medical records or evaluations that speak to the nature or severity of a child's disability, current developmental data that indicate a critical stage of breakthrough or attainment of an emerging skill. So if a student hasn't fully attained a skill, but they're working on a skill and it's almost there, the kind of data that you would have to show that they're very close to attaining that skill. Or things such as teacher observations, related service provider observations or information, parent input, especially as many of our LEAs are still providing remote instruction. Next slide, please. So when you are doing your eligibility determinations, you will apply these 3 criteria. So for the first criteria, which is determining the impact of a break in service on a critical skill, you'll be asking yourselves, will one or more of the child's critical skills be jeopardized by a break in service? And a critical skill is a skill that is essential to a student's overall educational progress. This can include academic skills like reading or non-academic skills, but those skills that have a direct educational impact, such as like a fine motor skill. And IEP teams, when you're talking in the context of a critical skill, you should be considering, like I said before, attained critical skills that are in progress or partially attained, or emerging skills. So a skill that a student has or a skill that a student is working on attaining. And when you're applying that first criteria, the IEP team will determine whether without ESY services, there is a likelihood of substantial regression of a critical life skill. That would be caused by the school break and a failure to recover those lost skills in a reasonable time following the school break. It's noted that some regression in skills typically occurs with all students during school breaks. That is fairly normal. We see that all the time. But those losses for most students would not be considered substantial. For students who have a substantial regression of critical life skills, those are the students that you want to be considering for ESY. For the second criteria, to determine the degree of regression, you'll be using 3 months of progress monitoring data to determine the degree of regression or the decrease in performance level or ability related to the previously attained or partially attained or emerging critical skill. So what does the progress monitoring data suggest about the anticipated degree of critical skill regression? And the IEP team must determine if there is a likelihood of significant regression, meaning that the child would need to relearn the critical skill or the skill set in its entirety to the detriment of their overall educational progress. For criterion 3, you're going to be considering the time required for recoupment. So due to like a natural regression, most children will require some reteaching for recoupment once school begins. A few children may require substantial time for recoupment of skills. You're going to consider, is the time required for critical skill recoupment extraordinary or substantial within the context of expectations for acquisition of additional skills during the new school year. So as compared to how a student is attaining those critical skills during a regular school year, would this time, and in comparison to other students, would the time required for recoupment be substantial? And some other considerations that you should be considering, as I've kind of have interwoven in these three criteria, is whether attainment of a critical skill is at a critical point in development. So that's an emerging critical skill. The rate of the student's progress overall, the nature and severity of the student's disability on an individualized level, the current service level that the student is receiving, the length of the break-in service and how that would impact the student's critical skills, and any other data or information regarding the student's performance and historical performance, including input from parents, service providers, and teachers. Next slide, please. So ESY services can be provided anytime, not just during the summer, although that is the most common time that we see it being provided. I know there are a few LEAs that have been providing in the past that have provided ESY services on evenings or weekends, especially on weekends. So ESY services may be provided through virtual, distance, or blended learning models at any point outside of the regular school day schedule. And ESY, the point here is really that ESY may be provided virtually. LEAs are responsible for providing any needed modifications, alternatives, supports, or services to make ESY accessible for students with disabilities. And this is something to consider, especially if services will be provided remotely, as you're currently doing. If a parent declines to make their child available for ESY services, that should be documented in the student's file in SEDS. This can be documented through documenting like missed services. You're also going to be documenting attendance in the attendance application. But if a parent outwardly declines it, we do want to see you documenting that in a communication log or in the miscellaneous documents. If you need more information on how to document that, please reach out to me directly. Next slide, please. So to complete the ESY eligibility documentation, IEP teams are required to use the ESY eligibility worksheet that is provided in SEDS. And you have to upload a completed worksheet for each child with an IEP within 5 business days of making the ESY eligibility determination. And that is consistent with OSSE's LEA data management policy. You may have already made many of your ESY determinations when you have been completing your annual IEP reviews, and that is totally fine. We do know that some ESY determinations have to be revisited during, like, between now and May to make sure that you have made the appropriate decision for that student, and especially if you did not have sufficient data at the time to make that decision. So if you're making this decision outside of the regular IEP review, please make sure that you're uploading it within 5 days. Otherwise, it was likely uploaded as part of your IEP, your annual IEP meeting. Next slide, please. OSSE has some resources to help you with ESY. So we have the ESY Services policy. We have an ESY Services FAQ. We also address ESY in some contexts in the COVID-related guidance that we have out, the OSSE's IDA Part B provision of FAPE, the guidance related to remote and blended learning. That guidance was updated in December of 2020, but the information related to ESY was not affected by that update. And you can also always reach out to me or my team, the policy team in the Division of K-12 Systems and Supports at osse.dsepolicy@dc.gov, and we'd be more than happy to provide assistance for all things ESY. And as I said, we'll be releasing a little bit more guidance around obligations that we've communicated in the past. There's no changes this year related to ESY obligations for like students transferring from closing charters, although I don't believe that we have any closing charters this year, and students who are transferring, students in non-public schools. Like we have a couple of different special populations that ESY affects. The guidance there is not going to change, but the form that we're going to provide that guidance in may change. We generally send an ESY memo to school leaders and SPED points of contact. It's more likely that we will be releasing a general guidance document and then a direct communication around the actual due dates for the other data systems that are associated with ESY. But if you have any questions about ESY, please feel free to reach out to me or my team. If you have any questions now, go ahead and drop them in the questions box, and I'll try to triage those before the end of the webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Christy. We are going to turn it over to Karen to provide us some IDA reminders and updates.
Good morning, everybody. This is Karen Morgan Donaldson from IDEA Monitoring and Compliance, and I have a few slides to share with you about monitoring and compliance. This slide is a reminder. You've seen this information before, but this is just a reminder to give you the high-level key points from a memo that went out on October 30th, 2020. All LEA leaders and special education administrators received this memo, and it provided updates to IDEA Part B monitoring activities and the monitoring schedule for school year 2021. And I just wanted to go over a few highlights. OSSE is implementing at this time an annual monitoring schedule focusing on 3 to 5-year-olds. Additionally, OSSE has shifted to a quarterly technical assistance touchpoint model based on LEA data. And again, that is a focus on 3 to 5-year-olds. In terms of flexibilities, OSSE continues to acknowledge the challenges that we all face, or all LEAs face, related to COVID. And we continue to allow the following flexibilities. We are still providing a 30-day correction window for LEAs to validate their data. And then we are also considering PWNs when determining correction of noncompliance. Please know that we are reviewing prior written notices. So when you are completing those, we are taking those into consideration as we monitor. Also, OSSE anticipates slippage for both LEAs and state compliance rates in areas related to timeliness. So this is our initial evaluation, our reevaluation, and our C2B timeliness. And then also in the memo, we provided an updated calendar of monitoring and compliance activities. And those activities and that schedule is provided later on in the presentation towards the end. Next slide. So I'd like to take a moment to provide LEAs with an additional monitoring flexibility that is as well COVID specific. OSSE is providing the following flexibilities related to signatures for both IEP participation of the IEP team and informed consent from a parent. So for the purpose of demonstrating meeting attendance, participation in an IEP meeting, any member of the IEP team that has participated in person must have a written signature. Any member of the IEP team that has participated by phone should include this designation as their attendance status on the signature page of the IEP. So those are required evidence as we monitor moving forward. For the purpose of demonstrating informed consent from a parent, OSSE is requiring a written signature or an e-signature be present. So student files without this required evidence that we list here will result in what we call a proposed finding, which all LEAs can appeal during our 30-day correction window in DCCATS. So again, appeals can be submitted through DCCATS using a newly added feature, which is request rescinded function that we will review in the next slide. I just wanted to give an example where an LEA might want to appeal a proposed finding. If an LEA is unable to obtain written signature or e-signature for consent, in this instance, an LEA can provide subsequent evidence that informed consent was gained by producing additional documentation. So for example, email or text message statements where the parent has indicated that they have been informed fully of what they are consenting to, and that they are providing a written statement of consent. So in this case, a prior written notice should be issued, but that would be an example of subsequent information and documentation that can be provided and submitted through DCCATS during the 30-day correction window. Another example, verbal consent can be utilized when other efforts to gain written consent have been documented and exhausted, and the communication memorializes the conversation by talking about and noting what was discussed, any concerns that the parents might have, and the reason why the parent was unable to provide that written consent by any other measure. So again, a prior written notice should be issued in that example as well. So again, these are just a couple of examples, but we are opening a new function in DCCATS to help LEAs appeal proposed findings during the 30-day correction window. And so our next slide it gives you an overview of this. So this slide provides information on how to make an appeal for a proposed finding in DCCATS. Again, LEAs have 30 days, the 30-day correction window, to make an appeal. And the way you do that is under reports, you select the report for which you would like to make an appeal. You should select the specific student in the non-compliance report. And under LEA status, you can now select request rescinded. So again, this is a new feature, a new function in DCCATS. Please note that this option is only available during the 30-day correction window. It will not be an option afterwards. In addition, LEAs must provide subsequent documentation related to the proposed finding. Again, any questions related to this process or the additional flexibilities related to signatures, feel free to reach out to me or drop a question in the question box here in the webinar. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Karen. We are now going to transition into some park remote assessment accommodations and updates in that area. I'll turn it over to Michael Craig.
All right, thank you, Tiffany. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Craig, and I serve as the assessment specialist for special populations. So I'm going to be talking about accommodations that are available during remote park testing. Next slide, please. All right, so accommodations provided to students on the park assessment must be generally consistent with those provided during distance learning and formative assessments. LEAs and schools should ensure that students receiving accommodations on the IEPs are consistent with what they will also be receiving on statewide assessments. Students should be familiar with their accommodations prior to taking statewide assessments and participating in park. Schools and LEAs are also responsible for ensuring that students receive appropriate accommodations during remote testing, keeping in mind that the method of delivery may look different than if the student were in person. We know that some student require accommodations to be administered by humans, and that may look different this year because of the remote posture, but we will dive into that in a little more in the next couple of slides. While some accessibility features and accommodations need to be administered externally by a test administrator, most are embedded in the platform. So again, schools and LEAs will see that most of the accommodations are already built into TestNav 8, the platform, but we know that there are some specific accommodations that students will require that are not. And students who receive accommodations delivered by the test administrator, so for example, human reader, scribe, human signer, they also may test via a remote administration, so they do not have to test in person, they can test remotely. Next slide. So some students also require paper-based accommodations. So for those accommodations, for those students who require paper test accommodations, they must be administered in person only, as secure paper materials cannot leave school buildings. So again, all paper materials must be administered in person because they cannot be removed from school buildings because they are secure materials. Examples of accommodations that are paper-based are Braille, large print, or a paper-based test. Schools that are open and serving students in any capacity for in-person or hybrid instruction or are operating distance learning hubs are required to provide the opportunity for students using paper-based accommodations to test in person. So again, so if schools are operating in any open in any capacity, hybrid learning hubs, anything of that nature, they are responsible for providing the opportunity for students to test in person if they have paper-based accommodations. Families that have chosen to participate exclusively in distance learning are not required to send their students to school to test. Next slide, please. All right, so each year OSSE releases the Testing Accommodations Guide. These guides are documents that for LEAs and schools to use as guidance and references for accommodations that will be available each year during statewide assessments. So there are 3 guides. Part 0 is the Accessibility Features Guide. Part 1 is the Students with Disabilities Guide, and Part 2 is the Guide for English Learners. So in Part 1, the Student with Disabilities Guide, we have Appendix C. This is in addition to this year's guide. It contains notes and examples of how to administer accommodations remotely, and there's specific guidance about those accommodations. If LEAs should contact OSSE if they have alternative means for administering of those accommodations. Similarly, in Part 2 for the Guide for English Learners, we have Appendix A, and it's the same chart, but there are accommodations for English learners. And again, LEAs and schools should reference both of these guides for guidance on the new accommodations for remote administration. Next slide, please. So as previously mentioned, we have the guide for students with disabilities. These are our human-administered accommodations for students with disabilities. So I won't read through all of them, but some of the more commonly used accommodations would be like read aloud for ELA. So the column on your left is what is listed in SES, and the column on the right is what is listed in the Park Accommodation Manual, and that's how they align. So again, so read aloud for ELA, scribe, speech to text for selected response, constructive response, and scribe for math. So those are just some of the heavy hitters that schools and LEAs should be familiar with. Next slide, please. So we have our human-administered accommodations for our English learners. This will also be found in the guide and in the appendix. Examples can include general directions, clarified in native language, human reader, text-to-speech, things of that nature. So LEAs in schools should definitely review the guides to see what the new guidance is for these accommodations that are listed. Next slide, please. And just here's an example of what the new appendix looks like for human-administered. This one is for our students with disabilities. So the chart itself, you have your SEDS accommodations, you have your park accommodation, and then you have the remote guidance that is provided by OSSE this year. So this is suggested remote delivery methods. Methods are detailed in the 3rd column. LEAs have developed specific protocols for providing any listed accommodations during instruction, or LEA's assessment that wish to use a statewide assessment should contact OSSE for discussion. So if an LEA in school has been using their own method of delivering these specific accommodations during formative assessments or during daily instruction, they should definitely contact OSSE for discussion if they would like to continue using those on statewide assessments. And additionally, to locate the testing accommodations guide, they are on the OSSE website on the testing accommodations page. So feel free to download these guides. They have been updated for this school year with all new information. So if you have questions about accommodations for PART, feel free to reach out to me directly, michael.craig@dc.gov, or drop your question into the chat.
Thanks so much, Mike. And again, we've been giving a lot of information this morning. So while folks are presenting, if you do have questions, please place them in the chat. We are here to answer as many questions as possible during this webinar, as well as, of course, we're available after the webinar, but we do not want you to leave with any questions unanswered. So feel free to use the question chat area in GoToWebinar to get those questions answered. We're going to transition into non-public updates and reminders, and we'll have Yvonne Smith to share those updates with us.
Good morning. My name is Yvonne Smith. As Tiffany shared, I am the manager of the non-public payment unit at OSSE. So we manage all the invoices and the funding for your enrolled students who attend non-public schools. Next slide, please. Okay, these are just a few reminders as LEAs who are responsible for your students enrolled in non-public schools, and some of this information may be helpful to you for your own enrolled schools. But again, the learning plans are still due every time the plan changes. And let me expound on that. In saying that, because we're in this virtual mode, some schools may be moving to hybrid or in person. So anytime the school determines a new plan for the mode in which they are going to provide services, they have to submit a new learning plan. So that's one reason to submit one if you're changing modalities from virtual to hybrid or from virtual to in person. The other need to submit a new learning plan is if the school had sent you a learning plan and gave a particular time frame that this plan will be in effect. For example, we will be providing virtual learning from September to January 31st. Then as January 31st nears, the school will have to submit a new plan to advise what they're going to do for, the remainder of the time. Even if the plan remains the same, because they provided an end date, they have to send in a new plan to say that we're going to continue with this plan to such and such a time or whatever the changes may be. Next slide. Another reminder is just some terminology that we use. At OSSE, we use distance learning and virtual learning synonymously. So you may hear us using both. Again, hybrid means you're alternating between both distance and in-person learning. And then continuous education takes place when both instruction and learning occur seamlessly across learning environments, including, in-person and virtual settings. Next slide. Okay, the famous LEA continued payment to non-public schools. Again, as learning plans change, you will also have to submit a new request for continued payments to non-public schools. So this is an ongoing requirement for LEAs, and please be advised that the reason we're doing this is to foster some collaboration between the non-public schools and the LEAs, so you all are on the same page with what is being provided to the students. So the process should be that a non-public school submits their learning plan for whatever particular period. The LEA will review it. You will have any discussions you need to have about that particular learning plan. And then the LEA will submit a form for continued payments to non-public schools for the period of time that the non-public school has designated their learning plan will take effect. So again, example, school ABC sends in a learning plan that will be in effect from January 1st through April 30th. The LEA will review that plan. If everything is okay, they agree with everything, the LEA will then submit a form for continued payments to that non-public school for the period of January to April 30th only. Again, the two must match. The form, the request for non-public continued payments time period will be correspond to the learning period time period as well. So I hope that's clear, because I've gotten lots of questions on that. So again, every time the learning plan changes, a learning plan must be submitted, and every time a learning plan is submitted, a form for continued payments to non-public schools must also be submitted. Next slide. Okay, some licensure questions. If you remember, at the onset of this pandemic, the DC Department of Health had issued some different regulations for this COVID period, and they kind of relaxed the license requirements. So that waiver that was issued on March 13 is still in effect now. So until further notice, it will be in effect. But everybody should check their license board to see what the current rules are. The DC license board just advises for our out-of-state providers, because we have a lot of non-public schools that are outside of the DC area, that you must have a current license. And you will, as long as you have a current license, you will be able to provide services to a student located in DC if the provider is physically located in Maryland or Virginia. So that will stay in effect. You just have to follow the rules of your own jurisdictions regarding any exceptions or rules regarding the upkeep and maintenance of your license. One other question that we had is, what if a student travels to another state? A DC student, say, goes to New York and is receiving services virtually from New York. Can I, a provider in DC, Maryland, or Virginia, still provide services to that student? In that case, you would have to check with your state's license regulations for that, and the state that the student has traveled to see if that will be allowed. I hope that answers that. But again, these are the same rules that have been in effect since the beginning of COVID. And your message today is that they are still in effect. You're still responsible for having up-to-date licenses according to your state regulations. Next slide. Okay, I think I went through all of this in one talk here. Next slide. Okay, attendance. Again, for the 2021 school year, it's really business as usual. Everyone is required to take attendance and log it into the appropriate OSSE attendance systems. LEAs and non-publics. Non-publics are required to use the OSSE seat system. The non-public schools will enter the student attendance logs directly into seats, and LEAs, you will review that attendance through the OSSE SLED application. So again, LEAs, you are still responsible for monitoring your non-public student attendance records, and LEAs, you are, and non-public schools, you are also still responsible for entering those logs. We have created new codes for this COVID period. They kind of mirror the regular codes, but we just have these COVID codes just so that we'll have records that we were in this pandemic for whatever the time period may be. So again, that hasn't changed. That's still a requirement. All the regulations regarding student absences must still be adhered to and followed up. And we understand that during this COVID period that you spend a lot of time just getting kids to show up. So the important thing to do during this time is to document. If you don't write it down, it didn't happen. So when Johnny and Susie don't show up, document it. You know, you're still responsible for doing all the required actions to re-engage a student when they've been absent for consecutive days, and so on. So LEAs, please be sure to monitor the attendance for those kind of occurrence. And non-public schools, you are still required to contact the LEA when you see that a student is experiencing consecutive absences. Nothing has really changed with that. But again, please document all you can in communication logs or your contacts with the student and the parents and so on. You can also put notes into the SEAT system as well. Next slide. The consent for telehealth services, as you know, at the beginning of the COVID period, this is just another reminder. You all probably have these already in file, but we just want to reiterate that this is an absolute requirement. You have to have a documented consent to receive not just telehealth services, but just services in general, telehealth, which is your related services as well. So whatever mechanism you already have in place, you know, you're free to use that. Here at OSSE, we created a template if you'd like to use it. It's on our OSSE COVID website, but everyone must have this consent to receive services virtually on whatever form you have. And throughout the COVID period, we've kind of provide different modalities that you can receive this consent. You can put it in your SEDS service tracker logs. You can, if a parent doesn't, cannot physically sign a form, you can have them email it. You can even have them text message it. But you'll have to put a copy of that email in the student's file in SEDS. And if you get a text message, you'll have to somehow transport that information to the doc and indicate that the parent sent a text message. But please make sure that these are in file on SEDS and marked as such, because these will affect us at some time or another for Medicaid purposes and for your own protection, as you know, students are going in and out of different modalities. This telehealth consent is also required when a student changes non-public schools. So if student is in non-public school A at one point and then they transfer to another non-public school, a new telehealth service form consent has to be signed, because now, you know, perhaps the new school has a new learning plan, has a new modality for providing services. So you will have to get a consent for virtual services from the new school as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, if you have any questions regarding all the information I've just provided, please don't hesitate to contact me. Here's my contact information. And again, these are reminders. This is nothing new. These are things we have been doing throughout the COVID period. And hopefully by now we've kind of perfected them into some way, shape, or form of methodology and process within our schools. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Again, feel free to put your questions in the chat. We are going to get to them at the conclusion of our presentation. Our staff is working behind the scenes also to type in questions, answers to you as well. We'll move on to our transportation team, and Douglas Johnson will provide us updates in this area.
Good morning, everyone. Douglas Johnson here. I hope everyone has been safe and staying warm throughout this COVID and all the cold weather we've been receiving. Thank you, Tiffany, and you can go to the next slide for me. Good morning, everyone. This is OSSE DOT's bus safety kit documentation. If you attended a couple of the last monthly webinars, we explained that we have safety kit documentation that will explain what we are doing at DOT to ensure that the students are safe during travel, and our staff is are safe as well. And as we always state, that student and staff safety remain our top priority, and we are focusing on the avoidance of the infection while students and staff are in transit and at work, and are implementing specific bus cleaning and disinfecting processes while transporting the students. And also parents, schools, and stakeholder communication and education. DOT is utilizing internal and external resources, ensuring all stakeholders are educated and informed on division, agency, and local federal information as we navigate through this new normal. And if you noticed any of our transportation and our buses out there lately, you'll see a rebranding of our division, and it reads District of Columbia Student Transportation. The rebranding effort is a small reflection of changes we've made to better communicate stakeholder representation and to serve you. If you downloaded this, the document for the presentation, there is a link for the video of our guide of reopening and how we're transporting students. And if you did not receive a bus safety kit in that documentation that we sent out some months ago, please email dot.data and I'll send out that documentation to you as well. Next slide, please. If we have any schools that are currently virtual and are thinking of considering going hybrid and they haven't updated the system with an in-person start date, please reach out to dot.data so we can input that information into the system for you. Having an in-person start date helps us forecast how many students we can, possibly have attending your school. So that in-person start date helps us out. Excuse me. That in-person start date helps us with projection with staff and also with routing when it comes to your school returning to hybrid learning or in-person learning. So please make sure you send us that date and that information for TOTE. Next slide, please. And finally, we have been giving trainers out through the whole year. We have some remaining TOTE training sessions. All training sessions are virtual. They'll be held on via Teams. And the dates that we have remaining are March the 3rd, 2021 and March the 17th. If you have any new coordinators at your school prior to those training dates, just please send us an email and we can have a one-on-one session with that new hiree at your school, so we won't delay any transportation needs for students at your location. You can always reach us at the TOTE support line Monday through Fridays, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And that number is 202-576-5520, or email us at dot.data. And also just reach out to us if you have any questions or concerns. And again, if there are any schools that need any calendar updates, please send that information to dot.data. And if you can send it out 20 days to 30 days prior to your in-person start date, that will help us out when it comes to routing the students. That's all the information I have. Again, everyone be safe and thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Doug. I'm going to stand in for our teaching and learning team to provide some just upcoming professional development opportunities. As Jen shared with us last month, the teaching and learning team has released their 2021 spring PD catalog. And again, when you download this presentation, it will take you to the live links here to get additional information around the PD session topics that are available in the winter and spring. We also want to make sure and highlight the secondary transition one-on-one training series, as they've had various dates that have been going on. We still have some current dates that are happening even this week around transition planning for our transition age youth, with the emphasis on how to create transition plans in a virtual space that we are in and accommodate, individual student needs. And again, this link is live to not only subscribe to our teaching and learning PD bulletin, but also view the recent bulletin that has launched for our winter and spring PD sessions. Lastly, if you have missed last month's webinar, we have a web page where you can watch previous webinars and download all resources and materials that were discussed in previous months. A recording of this webinar and slides will be posted to our web page within a week of our session today. Our next session will be March 17th at 10 a.m. Feel free to share this link with anyone at your LEA who you believe will benefit from this information. We may have some staff transition needs or new staff coming on board. We want to make sure that they have access to this webinar as well. Lastly, what you will see from this month moving forward to the end of the school year, we will have upcoming due dates in a slide. So just to remind you of things that are happening in coming months and due dates that are relevant to all LEAs. As Christy shared this morning about our ESY certification coming up on May 3rd, as well as I want to point out for you in June, our child outcome summary June checkpoints. You will be receiving additional information on timelines for that. Of course, you'll be able to review these slides after our presentation today, but this is just a reminder of things to have on your calendar as I see monitoring compliance activities may be happening or other deadlines across the agency will be reflected in this slide in months to come. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to be able to look at some of our questions that folks have added to the chat. Christy, I always rely on you to be my question monitor. Are there any questions that are beneficial to the good of the group today that folks have raised in our question chat?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions I think that would be helpful. We had a question about if there's any written guidance on what OSSE expects to see for signature related issues. So we don't have like written guidance related to specific actions that we're expecting to see. But if you refer to our COVID guidance, question 4 addresses if you can't obtain a parent signature, what other evidence will OSSE be accepting? And we're trying to be as flexible as possible here. We want to see verifiable confirmation from the parent that they are agreeing to whatever is being proposed. And if you look at our guidance, I believe it refers to like pictures of signatures, confirmations via email. Like we are going to try to be as flexible as possible, as long as it is something that we can verify that the parent has agreed, that the parent was informed about what they were agreeing to and that they actually did provide consent to you on it. And as Karen talked about, we'll be looking for like for example, for IEP meeting participation, we'll be looking at either a signature on the page or a designation that the parent attended via phone. And you may be getting findings in the initial findings period that you can then resolve during the 30-day corrections window. So if you have other evidence of the parent having participated or other evidence of an IEP team member having participated, make sure that you are documenting it in the student SEDS file so that after you are issued that initial finding, you can also provide us the evidence that that person had participated during the 30-day corrections window. So really just do your best in these situations. But we do have in the COVID guidance on question 4, we do have some information about alternative ways of obtaining that parent's consent. We got a question about the telehealth consent form and whether that's required every school year. I spoke with Yvonne Smith about this, and she confirmed that telehealth or virtual learning consent must be signed each time the student's learning modality changes, so between virtual or hybrid, or when the student changes non-public schools or LEAs. It's not needed for a change to all in-person learning, but if you have any questions about that, you should reach out to Yvonne directly. I think that is the bulk of the questions that need to be addressed.
Yes, and that's great. I do see there were transportation questions for Doug, and I want to make sure our hearts and minds are clear around transportation and ensuring that LEAs know when to submit a TRF request and with the various modes in which our students are learning right now. Doug, is there anything you want to clarify in that area in realm of transportation?
Austin DOT, we have a 10-day process. I know in the past where people, we would normally route before those 10 days, but we're utilizing our 10-day process because we have so many changes. And, one day LEA may say, hey, we're going to attend, and they submit all the transportation requests, and the next day, everything has come to a halt to go back to virtual learning. But as always, if you have a start date, for example, next March, let's say it's March 17th, I would suggest submitting those transportation requests, again, your calendar information in there, 20 to 25 days prior to the start of your in-person learning. So just make sure you have your cohorts, described out perfectly. They're in the system. If they're not in the system, we'll update the system to have that cohort you're requesting. But we have tons of cohorts in the system that may apply to the schedule that you're looking for. So just have all that information out and also communicate with the parents to ensure that the student will actually utilize transportation. You don't want to go through the whole process of submitting transportation, then the student not use transportation at the end of the day. So just make sure you have open communication with the parents, and the further out you submit your information, we can guarantee that you will have transportation that first day of in-person learning. I hope that's helped.
Thank you so much, Doug. Christy, am I missing any last remaining questions that may have come in?
Nope, I would just advise folks who have questions about telehealth forms to reach out to Yvonne Smith directly about when those forms may be necessary. There was a question about whether the form is necessary for all schools or just non-publics. It is required for all students who are attending a non-public school. So LEAs should be trying to get those forms completed for students who are attending non-public schools. And then for LEAs, the telehealth consent form is required both for service provision and for Medicaid reimbursement. So if your LEA completes Medicaid reimbursement, it would behoove you to have that form completed for students who are receiving telehealth services.
Okay, thank you so much, Christy. As always, for inside of each presentation, we have additional information on who to contact at OSSE for whatever your particular topic or concern may be. And I encourage you to use this as a reference point, as we are always here reachable and able to help you, assist you beyond this webinar. So any questions that you may have once this concludes, feel free to reach out to us. This is pretty much everyone you need to know within reason here at OSSE. If you have any additional questions or concerns, we want to thank you so much for joining us this morning for our February webinar, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Have a wonderful day.